see how much it hates me.
I thought my job was going to make me get it, but it doesn't look like they're going to.
They can't.
Well, they gave me, because we do work out at St. Francis Hospital. And the hospital was saying, because I carry a badge to work there.
Yeah.
I don't work there a lot. I used to work there a lot, but now I'm never.
I'm gonna get started, and if I'm talking to myself, it's because we're also talking to people on the internet. So, this. Well, I hope we can get through this. You know what? I forgot my notes.
Where you work at?
I work at Southern Sheet Metal Works in
Cool.
Tulsa.
Oh, yeah. Get your hands up a lot?
Yeah, I do. I do. I recently got over, I just had a really bad wound. I was drilling a stainless rivet and the bit broke and just cut into my finger, tore into me.
Yeah,
And that healed in about 2 weeks. It wasn't that bad, and you can barely see it, but that was my last bad injury. But I chopped You can see the scar tissue. I chopped the tip of my finger off there.
Oh yeah.
I've sliced myself there. I've busted knuckles open. I've always got little healing wounds all over me. But it's fun.
Yeah. Well,
Your
hey,
hands
it
get
makes-
tough. Your hands get tough.
yes, you do.
Oh yeah, I mean,
They have to. They have no choice.
like, what did I was putting together our CNC, which is just machined aluminum, but when you put it all together, it's just one thing to pick up one bracket, put together. But when you lift the whole thing up, it's still just like 1/8 inch machined aluminum
Yeah.
at the biggest spot, and you're like, okay, my hands are not that strong, and they just slice right through it. It's
Yeah.
not an edge. It's sharp.
Aluminum's one of the worst, believe it or not, because it's. My theory is that it's on like a microscopic level. It's what do you call it, serrated.
On an edge, yeah.
You know, it's like it's more serrated than like stainless will cut you
Could
really
be.
quick, but aluminum's a different kind of cut. It stings. It really stings.
That's like dog cut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing's only this big, right? And it weighs about 40 pounds. So when you just pick it up by those two thin edges, you're like, it just goes into
Yeah.
your skin. Your hands lift into it. And
we
you're
had
like,
a new guy
that's
start, and he had to listen
uncomfortable.
a whole stack of angle into this guy's truck, and he picked it up with his arms like this.
Mm-mm.
I mean, it was like a lot of steel, thin steel, and he sat it down, and when he pulled his arms away, it had just dug in and cut his arm like pretty deep. I mean, it looked like a knife had just got him, but it was just from the force just digging into him, and he learned a lesson that day.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's no joke.
It's crazy, but make some cool stuff from it.
Oh yeah, for
Kind
sure.
of makes sense about aluminum though, right? Because aluminum fuses really easy when it's clean.
Mhm.
So if it's got like teeth to sort of maybe like latch into itself. Anyways, we can talk more about that later.
Yeah, we can.
All day. Mark 13 is a very tricky chapter. Well, it can be a very tricky chapter. So before we get into this, understand there are parts of this chapter that deal with some pretty definite unknowns. And so this is one of those big faith chapters. A lot of the Bible you have to take on faith. Some of it there's reasons to think certain ways, and some of it is very clear cut. This is a bit of the think certain ways and a lot of faith chapter, just as a heads up. But it's a cool chapter, so let's go. Also, for the internet people, I don't have the thing I need to plug my network cable in, so woo, sketchy. So sorry. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Just think of everything that's happened leading up to this point, right? Like, he's just gone through the greatest commandment debate. He's gone through the widow and like the modesty and the power of the humility of giving all of her money, and like the annoying Pharisees and clearing the temple. And it's like, oh, what a pretty building we're in. What disciple asked this question and had the audacity to think this is a good time for this conversation? I feel like it's somebody who can't stand silence. So that was an intense day. What pretty stones, but they were big, and technically the stones that are there that are left, which we'll talk about in a second, are so heavy that like a lot of modern cranes like just wouldn't lift them. There are cranes now, like big sky cranes and things, but typical if your roll out vehicle cranes just would tip over.
Right.
So,
The
do-
Giants building.
what's that?
The Giants, they build them.
Yeah. Now, Herod, do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Understand the temple was almost a complex of buildings, right? Like you had the wall with the outer courts, which have little corridors, and you also had the actual like temple structure with the Holy of Holies and the inner court and all that stuff. So there's all these buildings could refer to the entire thing. When Herod was done building the third temple, it was like 400 by 500 yards, roughly, right? So like several football fields long.
Yeah.
It's a big one. But it's really difficult to figure out exactly where that outline was. But it wasn't done yet either. So at this point in history, it's only about half done. And so he built from like 19 BC. So this is probably around 28 to 30. No, that's not right. How old is Jesus? Yeah, 30 to 33, somewhere in there. 19 BC to 63 AD. So like, he's only got another 30 years to continue the structure. And then what Jesus talks about in this chapter kind of happens 7 years after it's done. It doesn't last that long either. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are fulfilled?" I don't know how far I should go in this before we just kind of sum everything up. I'm just going to read until I feel like stopping. Because this is a really hard one to segment out. It all kind of ties into itself. So, Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of the birth pains." Okay. Probably heard me talk about this. One of my biggest pet peeves is we're near the end sermons, right? Like, and I hear them a lot, and I do think there is a point in your life thing here, because it's typically by people in their mid 50s and up to maybe their like early 60s that I hear doing this. At least that's what it looks like. And so maybe it's just a point in our life where we all start thinking about this a bit more. I get that, but in general, I hear a lot of the conversation of, look at how bad the world is now, Jesus must be coming back soon.
I've said that before.
Okay, be very careful with that.
Okay.
It's fine to like kind of talk about it as far as this is how bad the world feels right now. It's not okay to say, look at how bad things are based on scripture, because that's not really what he says. What he says here is, this is all going to happen and is not an indication of the end times. And most people read this, I think, and say, hey guys, this is what's going to happen when it's warning us we're close to the end. People will be at war, there'll be famines, there'll be earthquakes, and like, as we've moved into the new century in 2000 to now, there's been more earthquakes and more flooding and more natural disasters, at least it feels like. And there's still wars and still famine. So part of the problem is we hear about them now. 30 years ago, all of this was still happening. We just didn't hear about it because international news wasn't really a big thing. So the more connected the world becomes, the more this is going to feel like it's happening. But it's just, if you think about it, I never knew what was happening in Japan. Now we do. So there's that. But it's also just not a sign. Like there's always been wars. There's always been earthquakes. The loudest noise ever recorded, like ever, is a volcano, Krakatoa, erupting, which I might be very off here, but I feel like was in the 16th or 17th century. That's just a number I'm pulling out from a vague memory.
I thought it was a Kiss concert I went to one time. With
No. I mean, this was heard almost around the globe in some way, shape, or form. And there's evidence of it in like sediment and stuff like that as well. There's random records of like strange astronomer or historian in their room writing a history of something in the 17th century, and all of a sudden they're all like, my room rumbled. The whole world seemed to rumble today, and it coincides with the last time that Krakatoa erupted. But it was from an earthquake, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, trying to remember. Doesn't matter. There's always been these things. These are not signs of the end times. These are just kind of like things that are going to happen throughout the future. And I think what Jesus is saying is, regardless of that, we're still doing our job, which is what he says here. It's kind of like don't be an alarmist, because what ends up happening is we end up feeding into this, Jesus is coming back soon, hunker down, prepare your heart, right? Rather than, Jesus could come back tomorrow, have we prepared the world? Right? So you end up kind of getting caught in this doomsday mentality, and he wants us to be very careful of that. We don't know. We do know. At this point, we have, at the very least, a year and a half. Like, at any given moment, we have at least a year and a half, because there's some definite signs that we have a year and a half warning of. So I mean, there's probably more of a buffer for other things that are happening, but at the very least, we have roughly a year and a half warning from like some definite events before Jesus comes back, and you don't really want to be around for that. But we'll talk about that. Also, the false prophets. We've talked about this before. How did Abraham or Abram, when God said, "Go until I tell you to stop," in Genesis 12, how did he know who God was? It's not an easy
Well, his
one.
first encounter with the burning bush?
That was Moses.
That's Moses.
Yeah.
Okay, we're talking about Abraham.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if there was a burning bush, we weren't told about
No, Moses.
it. He doesn't have anything to go off. Right? Like at this point in history, and according to Hebrews, his dad didn't worship God or understand God. He was a pagan worshiper, and he didn't know. And what we learn about God in between the fact that Abraham recognizes him as like the power in the universe and does what he says through the "I am who I am" statement from Moses, which, if you like trivia, is referred to as the Tetragrammaton. You don't ever need to know that, but it's a fun word. I am who I am. He's a self-fulfilling person. He's a self-validating person. It's one of those ideas that if you were to come face to face with God, you would know. Like there would be zero question.
Amen.
So when Jesus is talking about this, there's going to be many that come in my name. If somebody shows up and like you're kind of like, man, they're a bit of a bizarre guy, and they claim to be Jesus, and you didn't know,
Yeah, he's not Jesus.
it's not Jesus. Because one of the things that we learn from this chapter, amongst other chapters, is when Jesus returns, he's coming back as Jesus, not as a new type, not as a new incarnation. It's
Right.
the Jesus they met on earth, and people are going to know him. So, be aware, like if it's a surprise to you, probably not Jesus. Kick that person away. This is kind of right in lines with what we were talking about last week with prophecy. If somebody like speaks a new prophecy into your life, just run away from them. If it's something you're supposed to know, you would have had some inclination of it already. Such things must happen. The end is to the combinations. Okay, we read that. So, here's why it's important to recognize all this is going to happen. Through all of this, you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged. Sorry, one real quick. What was the temple made out of? Herod's temple. Just fun, like as a bit of a trivia piece. Why are they so enraptured with the temple? Other than the fact that it's real big.
Are you talking about the materials made out of it? Stone? Gold?
Like sandstone.
Yep. Stone. So every visible portion, according to like Josephus and other historical records and historians, like every visible portion of it was either gold plated or marble. What we have left are like retaining walls, so not even really like part of the temple itself, because that was deconstructed piece by piece. But like it was gold plated, and where there was no gold, it was marble, which in the middle of the desert is sort of a recipe for blinding people. It wasn't really a desert, but in the kind of wildernessy type area that it's in, it's actually not a desert at all. I don't know why I keep saying that, but it had big sun, dry climate, that kind of thing. So I don't if you've ever heard the story of this. Like there's a skyscraper in Vegas they built, and they didn't ever really do any math on it, but it's all glass, and there's a pool, and it's like a resort, and people would get like really like 2nd degree, 3rd degree burns from sunburns at certain parts of the day because it was curved and it would amplify the effect of the sun at a certain time of day on the people in the pool.
Like burning hands.
And they couldn't figure out why, so they had to go in and put like special glass on it, and it kind of directed the sun in different ways, but it just like collected the sun. There's also a really, really cool furnace in in France somewhere. It's a solar furnace, and it can like like to make steel, you have to have incredibly hot temperatures, right? It's a little tricky to get all the oxygen and all the things in there that you need to make good steel and to rip it out and still have heat. And so there's a solar oven that can like cook steel in a matter of seconds kind of thing. And it just is a big old set of mirrors that all point the sun into one spot. And it comes down and it's like something out of a sci-fi. Anywho, I'll show a picture one day. It's really, really cool.
Okay.
Why was I talking about this? So, but people said as you approach the temple, it was like it was covered in snow if you had never seen it before, because it's just so bright and white. Or you were blinded by the sun because it was gold and it was reflective. Also, fun fact, the total sum of gold mined by humans could fit in 3 Olympic swimming pools. Like, we actually never found that much gold. Apparently most of it was at the temple at some point.
Yeah.
Anywho, sorry.
That's all right.
You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in synagogues. This is, I think, directed specifically towards the disciples, but carries a warning for all Christians because you may come under persecution. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. We see that through the disciples. And the gospel must be first preached to all nations. This is one of these like check boxes, I think you can say, for looking towards the return of Jesus. One of the things that Jesus says is when he returns, the gospel will have been spread to all nations. So like during World War II, that couldn't have happened. And I know people during World War II thought this must be the end.
No, yeah.
Especially after the bomb, right? Like after the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like this was it. This was the end of the world. But like at that point in history, there are so many remote places that hadn't heard the gospel. So you couldn't have. And obviously we don't have a way of keeping attendance, right? Like around the world. But that's one of the things that has to happen. The gospel has to have reached everybody. And so for every year that Jesus doesn't return, there's that many more people that should have had the opportunity
To say yes or no.
yeah, or at least to
Least
begin
care.
down that path,
They're
right?
gonna be-
And so when people say, "Oh, Jesus is coming back soon," I kind of you want him to come back and you want to be in heaven with Christ, but like Paul saw that as a burden, like being on earth in some ways. But at the same time, that's more opportunity to build the kingdom. So there's kind of ups and downs to it, but in general, one of the things Jesus says is everybody's got the opportunity, so let's make sure that we use it. Excuse me. When you,
11.
thank you. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what you should say. This is very hard. I love this part. Just say whatever is given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Okay. Salvation Army is kind of a weird church, right? We are not under the influence of the soldiers and the core members the same way that a lot of churches are. So like a lot of church pastors, if their congregation doesn't appreciate them, can get them to go. Right? Salvation Army doesn't really work that way. And so it can be kind of tricky at times if you have a leader who isn't putting time into their sermon. And I have heard people say, I know it enough. I don't need to study it. I don't need to prep anymore. I just let the Holy Spirit speak through me. Or I just write a couple things down on a piece of paper and let the Holy Spirit lead me. That is not what this is talking about.
Right.
Okay? There's a difference between preaching and teaching and going in front of a court for persecution. And so what he's saying here is like, don't fret. Don't worry. If you are going to stand trial for your faith, the Holy Spirit will take care of you if you let it. But if you're like me, you practice every conversation you think anybody ever would have had with you that day. Like you get lost in that if you're not careful, and it's really unhealthy. It used to keep me up at night. What if I had done this, if I was more aggressive with this? And I'm like, I would never have said that, but that's what I wanted to say in my head kind of thing. So that, it's not talking, if you ever have an officer or a preacher or a pastoral leader who says they don't do a lot of prep or they don't think they need to, either confront them about that or go find somewhere else because you're not going to be fed. Like Brittany and I set out the whole day once a week, which may not sound like a lot up front, but like throughout the year is regardless of what we're doing, we have one day a week where we set out for prep for today, for tonight, for Sunday, that kind of thing. And if I'm having a particularly rough week or a rough day, or just in kind of not a great place spiritually, I typically just shut my door and find something to study and explore something in the Bible just to be refilled and refreshed. So I take that very seriously, and a lot of officers do, but this is not giving you free pass to never prepare to talk about your faith.
Right.
Totally okay to practice that. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And now, this is pretty self-explanatory, I think. Even Jesus was not exactly appreciated by his own family. A lot of people that don't grow up in a Christian home have to make some firm line at some point in their life between their faith and their family, and that can be very difficult. In other countries, that results in death or imprisonment or conscription, in slavery, like depends. In America, it's mostly you just got to choose between your family and your faith. Now we get into some of the just real quick, these are the beginning of the birth pains in verse 8. I don't know if you've ever experienced being with somebody who's in labor.
Yeah.
It's not exactly a quick process.
No.
I know for Caleb, Brittany was in the hospital. We got there. We had an appointment at 4 in the morning, I think. 4:30 in the morning, something like that. For some reason, I was like, wait, we're setting the schedule for when this baby's coming and we have to get here at 4:30 in the morning? But we got there 4:30 in the morning and the baby didn't come till like midnight the next day. Like it's not so this is a way of saying like, there's more pain to come. A lot. So, 'twas a long day, and I'm sure a much, much longer day for my wife. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, what is this a reference to? Any ideas?
Uh-uh.
Have you ever heard the phrase before?
Abomination, that's like, I can only give you an example. That's like God said don't have particularly with animals.
Yeah.
That's an
So,
abomination.
but this is, that's an abomination. So this is the abomination, a particular heinous thing that causes desolation, or that brings desolation, right? So this is like, it's in quotes. It should be in quotes, at least single quotes in your Bible, because this is a direct quote from Daniel, and it's a reference to a couple things. Now, we need a little bit of history here, I think, to work through some stuff. Before we get into that, I think I skipped something. You will be on account of me, you will stand witness to them. This phrase, the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Number 13, verse 13 there. Does that everybody have stands firm? In verse 13.
Mine's endures to the end.
That's a much better one.
Yeah, mine says stand on.
Okay, so the actual word here is it's a Greek word hopomeno, which is to remain under something. So it's not like if you're being persecuted, what the message here isn't do everything in your power to get out from under that persecution so you can live your life a little bit less painfully. It's the one who endures through it. If there's an opportunity to not be persecuted, great, but like the one who can stand firm through this, who can endure, who can remain under it and keep their faith and not make some sort of concession in their faith to get out of it, is the one that we're talking about here. So if you're under persecution, there's a chance that we have to just stick with that until God sees fit to release us from it, or to offer an opportunity for us to get out, or until he returns. But it's a kind of a weird translation, is all I wanted to point out. So the abomination that causes desolation is a direct quote from Daniel. If you want to flip to Daniel 11, we can just glance at it real quick. I always have a horrible time finding Daniel. It's near Ezekiel, right? Yeah. So Daniel 11:31 is part of a prophecy of debatedly both the end times and the fall of Israel under the Greeks. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist.
Do you talk about the Antichrist here?
I don't think so.
No.
I think that is how it has been interpreted a lot. There's two things, though, that help here. First off, Daniel is a prophetic book, not just about what's happening in Babylon and his interaction with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and all that in the burning furnace and the fire furnace and this golden statue and all that. It's a prophetic book about both the fall of Babylon and the fall of the devil, I guess, or evil in the world, because it's also a bit about the end times. The weird thing about Daniel is a lot of what he prophesies can be very easily seen from the point of Daniel to the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, kind of like that window. And so what he's talking about here is often looked at as fulfilled already. That is until Jesus comes and talks about it coming, like the abomination that causes desolation coming in the future. So we talked about this before, how during the intertestamental period, so between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's 300 or so years, and a lot of stuff happens to the Jews. Right? They're not sitting idle, just nobody's writing about it, apparently. Well, nobody nobody in our Bible. Yeah. In the Apocrypha, there's 1st, 2nd, 3rd Maccabees, and a few other books that kind of dance around what's happening. There is a Greek ruler who comes in, and this guy is like super Greek and super anti-Jew. His name's Antiochus Epiphanes.
Wow.
And he goes a little ham, oh, no pun intended, that was horrible, on the temple. So one thing the Jews can't do is pork, or pigs in general, right? So he sacrifices pig flesh on the brazen altar. He sets up brothels and different horrible things in the temple courts where Jesus has just turned the tables over,
Right.
like that kind of area. And he also set up a statue to Zeus in the Holy of Holies and required people by law to worship it. And so a lot of people kind of personify the abomination that causes desolation as this dude, because he sort of is the reason the Maccabees revolted eventually. Like there's a small group of people that were like, heck no, we can't do this. This is just one too many wrong things. But yeah, so he sacrifices a pig, prostitutes, statue of Zeus, all bad. This is also where we start to see the division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Sadducees are the ones that are like, guys, it's a lot easier to be a little bit more Greek than it is to stand up to these guys. And the Pharisees are saying, no, we need to be super Jews. Here's all the laws, right? These super Jews. And so that is what most people think this is talking about, at least from Daniel. But then Jesus comes and says, it's still coming. And so what it is, and there's a couple of theories here. Well, did I finish even this thought? When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it doesn't belong, let the reader understand, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Excuse me. Where is he talking about it standing where it doesn't belong? Based on how this chapter started.
In the temple?
Yeah. And so most Jews believe, and even a lot of Christians believe, that this comment revolves around the temple. And it's sort of one of these things, one of these checkbox things is that has to happen before Jesus returns. And when the abomination that causes desolation comes, it will be a year and a half before the return of Jesus. That is one of the few very specific things we know, and that number comes from Daniel. And I will say there is a train of thought in the book of Daniel where people think the numbers are more symbolic of ages or not necessarily like this many days. There's a couple instances where it's very obviously that, and the rest it seems very literal. So I say hogwash, what's a year and a half? Fine. Like that kind of thing. Doesn't really matter. When this happens, it means Jesus is one step closer to coming. But so a lot of it because of this and the reference to the temple and the fact that this is all based around this question about the destruction of the temple. Right? So one of the disciples says, okay, when is Jesus says the temple's going to be torn down. The disciples say when, and then he goes on to this speech. So the context seems to be saying that this desolation is going to start at the temple. It's going to be something based around the sacrificial system or the Holy of Holies or something that causes this to happen. That doesn't really make sense to me, except for the fact that I do think this is directed towards the Jews. As Christians, the temple and the Holy of Holies don't really mean anything anymore, right? So the sacrificial system, like what are we worried about somebody upsetting the altar for? We kind of, sacrifices are over, right? So there's that element, but I do think this is directed towards the Jews because there is a lot of references in the New Testament to the Jews having a special place, a special battle, a special bit of progress to make in their faith during the end times, like during, the tribulation and all this different stuff. Like they're going to have an opportunity to come to Jesus. And so this might be directed towards them specifically. And he does kind of reference this in a minute as well. So a lot of people think it's somebody just desecrating the temple. So some people say it's this Antiochus guy. Some people say it was during the destruction of the temple, which has already happened. Right? And the temple's not there anymore. And then there's a couple other cultural weird nuances here. The temple was finished, Herod finished it in 63 AD, or his people finished it. I think he was well dead at this point. I think. 70 AD is the destruction of the temple. The poor guy spent almost 100 years building this thing, or 67 odd years, something like that, and it was destroyed 7 years later by accident. So the Romans go to battle against the Jews. There's uprisings. They make Judaism illegal. They make Christianity illegal. They go to bat against the Jews. And the Jews are warned in this passage when they see this coming to flee. And the record of this event says that the Jews flee, that they ran to the hills and they hid in caves. And so a lot of people think some of this has been fulfilled. I'm not so certain that is important or that it has been. But we see a principle here that I'll get to in a second. So the Romans, as they're attacking, they're obviously a much bigger army than the Jews, begin to sort of get further and further into Israel. And eventually the last sort of holdup is in the temple because it's the biggest, strongest structure in the land. And so they attack it and they can't get in. And history tells us and legend tells us that drunk soldier lit it on fire by accident, and by the end of the night the whole thing was in flames and all the gold melted into the stonework and it was just destroyed the temple. But fire doesn't really hurt gold, it just changes its shape.
Yeah.
And so shortly after that the Romans came and completely, stone by stone, took apart the temple to get all the gold back, and nothing was left. To the point where we really don't know what the border of Herod's temple was because it was so effectively removed. We know some bits of it, but we can't make a three-dimensional shape exactly. We have a good idea from records, but not from archaeology. And so it's an interesting thing. But yeah, basically they were stupid and now the temple's gone. So if you think about this for a minute, if Jesus is saying the abomination that causes desolation is going to happen, and it is linked to the temple, that means the temple kind of has to exist before Jesus returns, right? Along with other prophecies lending its ear to this. Problem is the temple doesn't exist. Not right now. Not really. And up until just after World War II, in the 60s, I think, when Israel got its independence again, there was zero hope of the temple ever existing. So for like 2,000 years, the chances of the temple even existing were zero, because the Israelites were not in control of Israel.
Right.
Now they are, but they're not at peace, and they don't have control of the site of the temple. Right? That is an Islamic church right now. So the battle over the temple on the mount, or the battle over the Dome of the Rock, that is important because the way that we read this, Jesus won't return until that's not the case anymore. What I don't want you to get from this, though, is we got to take care of some things before Jesus comes back. This is all within the plan of God, all right? I say that with some flexibility. There's a small group of people in Israel, a handful, a few thousand maybe, that are actively trying to rebuild the temple, to get all of the same kind of uncut stones, to get all the original materials together to build the temple. I think it wasn't that easy to get them back then, and it certainly isn't easy to get them now. Because they can't use modern tools and stuff, and there's no red cows, and purple dye is virtually impossible to get. Purple dye that they used to build the temple back then is from slugs. Kind of hard to manufacture. That's why it was a color royalty. Like, it's really, really hard to make any substance of. So anyway, there are people trying to make that happen because they want the Messiah to come. And part of their understanding of that is that the world's got to be in a pretty rough shape for that to happen. So I would just say all of that to say God's going to use people and events to make this happen when it's time to make this happen. And unless you have a calling from God that is probably confirmed by a lot of things, it's not really our responsibility to rebuild the temple. Also, there's other prophecies that talk about Israel being at war, basically, until...
Yeah, it's true. They always got somebody.
Yeah, well, they can't be in peace. So when we talk about the abomination that causes desolation, you need to remember two things. One, there will be an event that is very clear desecration of Christian and or Jewish values. And basically all of us will know about it. And from that point forward, you're on the downhill slope to the end of the time, end of the world. Which I guess is actually an uphill thing. Wait, which way's better, down or up? It's the good way for us, doesn't matter. And that according to Daniel, and I think reaffirmed by Jesus here, I'm not wrong about that. Oh, we may come to that in a minute. I don't remember. You have a year and a half before the actual march of Jesus onto earth. So, let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back or to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in the winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning of time when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. So, if Hitler killed 127 million Jews, or whatever the number was, that's nothing in comparison to what we're expecting. And as far as the just sheer atrocities that are going to exist. They talk about, there's people who have studied and put together a number of the 450 million Christians that have been martyred over the last 60 years or whatever. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but they exist. It's nothing, right? And so we haven't seen anything as bad as what has happened in history even come close to what we're expecting from this point in history, in the future. So when you say Christ is coming back soon, that's kind of a horrifying concept for non-Christians, because stuff's about, and even for Christians, it's about to get tough. And part of this encouragement is to stay strong under persecution, because my guess is everybody who's a believer will be persecuted during this time. So, buck up. Bolster up. 2 Thessalonians, I think. Why did I write that down? Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. Okay, so that's another reference to the abomination that brings dissolution. Now, is it explicitly the Antichrist? I do not think so. It's just another bad thing. That's all just going to get built in and get even worse. So if you can imagine somebody as evil as Hitler, who isn't the Antichrist, right? Like he made those decisions on his own. Now you're getting somebody who's motivated by a much purer kind of hate. Like, it's going to be worse. If the Lord had not cut those days, short those days, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. Do we need to talk about that at all?
Huh?
Who are the elect?
Us.
Yeah, believers. We don't really have time to go more into that, but there is some cautionary things in there that I'd like to talk about someday. At the time that anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, snails and mollusks is what Brittany was reminding me, like purple. She was telling me the story the other day about how hard it was to get the purple. The purple died, so they had to harvest it from sea mollusks and snails. It's crazy.
Yuck.
Yeah. And how much purple can you get out of them? Not much. Next, I'm not sure that's how it worked, but that was the idea. Where were we? At the time, look, here's the Messiah. Look, there he is. Do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear to perform signs, wonders, deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Obviously, if the sun goes out, the moon ain't shining.
Right.
Tis 2021. We've known that for a long time, but apparently there are people in this universe that don't believe that anymore. So the moon doesn't produce light. God made physics, and it's okay. But it's one of those things like, we're close to the end times. I'm sorry. As much as there is light pollution, the sky is still super pretty if you go somewhere else. I don't think we're there yet. This is essentially nature groaning. This is the universe crying out. Things are in a bad way. This is not the way that creation was intended. And to the point where it's gotten so bad that even nature is just begging God to end it, to fix it, to finish it.
Well, it said when Cain killed Abel, it said that God said that the rocks cried out to him. And
he said, the ground cries out to me because of your son or your brother's blood or something like that. And even and Jesus says, if nobody else praises, the rocks and the trees will. As much as they're not sentient, they don't have to be to praise God. Lack of intelligence isn't lack of an awareness of the divine. I think there's
got water from a rock, didn't he?
Yeah.
That's supposed to be Jesus, isn't it? The rock.
No. Now later, when they talk about the rock, Peter is referenced as a rock. Jesus is also referenced as the foundation, the rock. There's 2 instances where water comes from a rock for Israel. There's some debate about when and where and how and if there are 2, but there's definitely 2 instances. What's interesting is there is a growing argument for the fact that rock traveled with them. Now, there's no reason to believe this in Scripture, but as you begin to get close to God, you want to consider this. I would say it's within the possibility of God, but this rock, there is an argument because of its name and the way that the travels work that it might have actually moved with them. I don't know. I mean, he moved a cloud with them. Why can't he move a rock? I would be careful interjecting Christ into anything in the Old Testament. Not, I would say, his will, his messengers, his agents, his purpose is there, his presence exists, but we don't see a representation of him until the New Testament.
Right.
And I say that because there are people who will argue things like Melchizedek was Christophany, which is an incarnation of Christ before Jesus, and I think that's hogwash. That's just nonsense in my opinion. It really devalues his presence later if that's the case. But yeah, I would just be careful in interjecting any of that. There's a couple places where you get the representation of God as well, but it's not like the person of God, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Without going through them all specifically, I think I have a really hard time summing that up. At the time, the people will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. P.S. What is the Mount of Olives? Because right now they're sitting on the Mount of Olives, right? Which means they're just kind of overlooking the temple. It's supposed to be gorgeous, just like you got this magnificent gold and marble building, and you're just overlooking the city. So they're having this whole conversation looking at their beloved city that's about to look. What is the Mount of Olives famous for?
Where Jesus prayed at? What happened?
Fruit-wise.
Olives.
You'd think so. But I'm going to go with the fact that olives are death fruit and shouldn't be ingested, and Jesus wouldn't have made that a centerpiece of his ministry. No, it's famous for figs.
Okay.
Don't know why it's called the Mount of Olives. Didn't know that until today, but it is famous for its fig trees, which are unique in this area of the world in that they bloom at a different time than every other tree in this section of the world.
You ever eat a fig?
Yeah, I don't care for
I
them.
don't like them either.
They're dumb fruit, but olives are worse.
You better a fig.
You're not missing anything. It's like a bad raisin.
Yeah.
It's not good.
Gross.
What the heck was I talking about? And raisins are just bad grapes. So.
Right.
Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and the leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Most of the trees in this part of the world bloom at the end of winter, not the end of the spring. So this is a unique tree. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So, basically, he's saying there will be signs, and when you see those signs, the end is coming. Regardless of where you are in that timeline, my instructions are eternal. Not the earth isn't, the kingdom isn't, not God's kingdom, but the kingdom of Israel isn't. Which is a big claim, right? Like for Jesus he doesn't do a whole lot early in his ministry or throughout his ministry until the last week leading up to this. Oh, P.S. He's saying this at Passover, right around the time that these fig trees would be blooming. So there's a good chance that what he's explaining is happening in front of them. So what was I talking about? Fig trees. Oh yeah. So he's saying, look, what I say is more eternal than the rocks around you. And that's one of these few I'm divine statements that Jesus has. And at this point, if the disciples have anything else to say, they should just shut their mouths. But he finishes. About that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven or the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge with each of their tasks and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house might come back. Whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows at dawn, if he suddenly comes, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, keep watch. So that is sort of commission to us, right? If the kingdom here on earth that we are supposed to be building is the house of Jesus. He's putting us in charge while he goes away for a while. So you have your servants, right? You have the servants in charge, each with their assigned tasks, plus you have one at the door keeping watch. That would be their authority, their work. Did I write these down? And something else that's really common. Resources, right? We have to manage, so the church, you got their house, you're managing their resources, that's the church. You have to maintain the church as Christians. You have to manage his authority, which means you're now taking responsibility for the work of Jesus. And you have to manage, well, what was the third thing? I said them backwards.
Resources?
Resources?
Is that what you said?
So resources, authority.
You said it, but I can't remember.
I can't remember either. What the heck? Anyways, doesn't matter.
Watch.
He has put us in the place of himself while he's gone. This is a big deal because I don't think a lot of Christians really value their input into the kingdom enough. Their effect on the world. And I think a lot of Christians think that we're very much just these sort of happy followers that are walking around and hopefully doing our best for Jesus, but if not, he's got it covered. But the idea here is he has left that for us to accomplish. And this is mirrored throughout most of Jesus' ministry. He expects us to take the work of forgiveness to the world, right? A lot of Christians, I think, sit back and be like, Jesus will forgive them. I'll just invite them to church. Well, it's actually kind of your job to extend that to them. It's our job to make sure the church is taken care of, to make sure the poor and the vulnerable are taken care of, to make sure that we're doing what's right. By doing this in love, not by hitting them over the head with our belief practices. I kind of talked about this on Sunday. You can't, either of you are here, so this is new. Okay. You got to make people wish Jesus was true before you can prove to them he is. And we'll talk a bit more about how you do that on Sunday, but in general, you can't start by saying you can't come to church because I believe that what you're doing is wrong. I know Christian families that have excommunicated their daughter because she got an abortion, right? I'm sorry, you're never going to help bring that person to Christ or heal that person's journey in Christ that they had already started if your response is to separate yourself from them, right? And they're never going to see Jesus again. You've basically done the work of cutting them off yourself, not them. They made a mistake, or whatever's happening in this person's life, if it's a sin and you cut them off, that's now your responsibility. Versus, there's only really one reason that we're able to cut people off as Christians, and that's when they are an actual detriment to our faith. When you start leaning back from God because of their influence. That's when you cut them off. That's when you shake the dust off your feet and keep on trucking. But other than that, we have to love on people. You don't have to condone their behavior, but you have to be able to love people in a way where they see the joy and the peace and the power that Christ has in you and say, man, I wish that were real and I could have that. And you're like, well, I'd be happy to talk to you about and show you where it is real, how it is real. But you can't take the responsibility of Jesus without taking the heart of Jesus that he had in the community. There's a reason that he typically dealt with the poor and the broken, because they were the ones who needed something that were going to listen to him. The Pharisees had in their mind everything they needed. They weren't going to listen to him. So he didn't waste his time. So, I don't know how I got on that.
That's pretty good, though.
That's it. Jesus is coming back, not tomorrow. The big stuff hasn't happened. When he does, everybody will know it. It won't come from somebody else, right? Nope. Your neighbor knocks on the door and says, "Hey, did you hear Jesus came back last night?" Yeah, no.
Yeah, he's been nice.
You're gonna want to double check that. And it wouldn't be the first time. All those we lived in Dallas the last time there was a Judgment Day prediction. There's billboards all over the city from the guy who, once again, predicted the same guy. I don't know how he keeps getting away with this. Right? The same guy predicts the end of the world.
Yeah.
He did it. He did it 4 years or something like that. Before that, he did it in the late '80s or early '90s.
Yeah.
And people keep sending him money for some reason. So he had these massive billboards on busy streets in Dallas, and I was just like, nobody will know, not even Jesus knows. By the way, which is an option, right? Like, he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, he's fully man and fully divine. He has chosen to give up that information. In the Bible, in Jewish and in ancient cultures, when you forget or when you remember something, there's an actionable item to it. So to do something, in, you know, if you say, in loving memory of so-and-so, like, right? In loving memory of John Smith, we do this every year or whatever. Well, in ancient days, there was an action to that. So if you're going to do something in memory of somebody else or of a special person, that usually involved you actually doing what they did. So as a really bad example, if you were going to do something in memory of Martin Luther King Jr., you probably actually have to walk in a civil rights march across a bridge in Selma, Georgia? What state was this in?
I was just a young kid. I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Selma somewhere, right? I should know this. Doesn't matter.
I was 8 years old.
South Carolina? North Carolina?
I was 8 years old.
The city's called Selma, I know that much. But like that would require you to do something, and to forget something is also kind of an actionable, like you've willingly forgot it and you're going to pretend it never existed. So like if you forgive and forget your spouse's misgivings one day, you can never bring those up again.
That's right.
Like that's kind of the implication that this has. So if he's willingly forgotten it, it's gone. There's no, like, it's not coming back because he's made an action on this. 'Twas all.